All right, welcome to the Imperfectly Inspirational Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Bowman. We're so glad that you're tuning in this week. I hope that you enjoyed our first two-part series that we tried last week. I know it wasn't as long as I hoped it would be, but this week's definitely going to be longer. That was our first one, trying to expound on it. We had a little bit of trouble doing so, but bear with us this week. We are going to be fully in-depth a lot more. And I do want to apologize for my YouTube listeners. If you tried to listen to some of the Beatitude series on YouTube, I happened to scroll through there and realize that there were a few that had no listens at all. And I was like, wait a minute, this isn't normal. And I realized that they somehow got put on private, which means they didn't show up at all in our directory as you were scrolling through. So I apologize about that. If you missed some Beatitude series on our YouTube channel, check it out there. And no, we don't have a full video. It's just our podcast through YouTube podcast. It just scrolls on a screen. So, but either way, I thank you for tuning in and giving us those views each and every week. So as we jump into another two-part series, we're going to talk about a phrase that kind of gets overlooked in the Bible and sometimes laughed at. And that is the phrase, gird up your loins. And I know it sounds silly, it sounds a little crazy, but it's from the Old Testament. And when you think of this word, you don't think a lot about it, but really, this word is a command. It is a mindset. It's a lifestyle. And this phrase is powerful. And if we really get to understand what it means, it can really begin to reshape the way that we approach our calling in life, our struggles, and ultimately our readiness to serve God. So let's jump into Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 17, and I read from the ESV version. It says, "But you dress yourself for work, arise and say to them everything that I command you. Do not be dismayed by them, lest I dismay you before them." So, well, where's gird up your loins, Chris? Well, let me tell you, if you look at the King James Version and some older translations, you're going to see it'll say, "But you gird up your loins, arise and say to them." So that's where that phrase comes from. Now, in our modern terms, God is telling Jeremiah to get ready. He's saying, get ready. I'm calling you to action. Hey, this is not a drill. That is kind of the idea behind this phrase. So let's talk about the context of where we get that phrase and what does it really mean. So in biblical times, the men, they commonly wore these long tunics. They were comfortable, nice and airy in the hot desert sun, but they definitely were not practical for any physical labor or warfare. So when it was time to run or fight or get to work, they would reach down and they would pull the hem of this tunic. They'd pull it up and they'd tuck it into their belts. And this freed up their legs so this way they can move freely and do what they need to do. So that's where the phrase gird up your loins comes from. So in essence, it was this practical action that signified readiness, agility, and actually intention to do something. No one just girded up for fun. It really meant if you saw people girding up, something was about to go down, something important. So this phrase became synonymous with this mental and physical preparation for something serious, typically challenging, but it always had a purpose for it in the end. So when we think of this phrase, what does it mean for us today? Well, what do we need to gird up in our lives? Because if we're not tucking robes into belts, we do have other things that we can get tangled up on or that prevent us from moving forward in the way we should, whether that be spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and even physically. So let's ask ourselves, what needs to be dealt with, cleared away, or really tied up in our lives to be fully prepared for God's calling? Well, maybe it's fear that's been crippling your confidence. Maybe it's comfort. And I tell you, I'm going to be honest, comfort is a really big one. Many of us get into a spot where we just enjoy life in the moment. And if you're comfortable in the comfort zone, you're not going to be moving forward. And we know that comfort is the dangerous kind of zone to be in, that comfort zone. But anyways, let's move on. Or maybe it's comparison. You're comparing yourself to others. Anxiety, you're struggling with that. or this voice in your head that just says, you're not ready. How many have heard that voice before? Another thing is time management. There's a lot of people that struggle with that. We're overcommitted, just constantly busy, but not spiritually fed, right? So there's a lot of things that could be tripping us. That's the whole point of this long list, is that there's so many things that could be tripping us in our lives. But let's dive into some scripture and get a kind of a breakdown on how we could deal with these things or what scripture says about that. So in Hebrews 12:1, it says, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. See, here we're told to throw off every weight, not just sin. So understand that, yes, we want to get rid of sin, but we're told to throw off every weight, every hindrance, and that includes doubt, distraction, delay. See, God is not asking us to be perfect, but what he's asking is for us to be prepared. And this verse, it's calling us to this discipline of release, letting these things go, to lay aside the things in our lives that hinder us from moving forward. Let's also look at 1 Peter 1:13. It says, therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. That phrase, preparing your minds for action. Did you know that in the original Greek, it literally means gird up the loins of your mind? So we're not just talking about a physical metaphor here now. I talked about at the beginning, it was, getting ready for physical action. But now we're talking about mental and spiritual readiness. It's about deciding in advance that we will be people who are present and purposeful and ready to respond when God calls. I know you say, Chris, it's all great to hear this, but my life is busy. How do I put this in my life? Well, let's talk about that. Many times we get up, we drive to work, or we're at home changing diapers with our kids. We're replying to emails. We're trying to even remember if we fed the dog, right? We understand that life is loud, is chaotic, and if we are not intentional, the noise of life, it just becomes normal. And girding up our loins and being ready in our modern world, it might look like this. It might look like waking up 30 minutes earlier to sit with God before all the craziness starts. It might mean saying no to that extra commitment because we've decided that it's not critical to our life's mission at the moment. It could also mean addressing what's inside. Those weights that we carry silently, that unforgiveness, that shame, that resentment, or maybe it's this quiet disappointment in how our life is just unfolding in front of us. So let's take a moment to reflect on something from the Old Testament here. In Exodus 12:11, when God was preparing the Israelites for the Passover, he gave them these instructions. He said, in this manner you shall eat, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. See, even when they were eating, God told them to be dressed and ready to move because deliverance was coming. So folks, what if we live that way? Expectant, ready, and positioned for movement. What if we live that way? Well, let's think of some things in our lives that we could pray about and write down to help us get to that. The first thing is, what are the emotional and spiritual or mental loose ends in my life that's tripping me up? The next thing is, what's one practical step that I can take today to gird up for what God's calling me to do? And the next thing is, am I waiting to feel ready or am I willing to be ready? So as we reflect on that verse about God calling the Israelites to be ready, are we willing to be that way? What are those things in our lives that are tripping us up? What's one step that we can take to gird up for what God's calling us to do? And are we waiting to feel ready or are we willing to be ready? So let me tell you something that's encouraged me in my life when I felt unprepared. And we know that God, he doesn't waste a single detail of our lives. And that's the great thing about God. Even in those places where our life may feel messy or we feel that we're disqualified from doing certain things, those are sometimes and many times the places where his strength shines the brightest. Because in 2 Corinthians 12:9, he said, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Folks, readiness is not about showing up in your own strength. No, it's about trusting that his grace is going to meet you right in that middle of that moment where you feel not enough. So here's your encouragement, folks. Girding up, getting ready. It doesn't mean that you have all of the answers. It doesn't mean that you're never afraid. It just simply means you're committed. You're available, and you're leaning into what God has for you without those tripping hazards in your life. So take 5 to 10 minutes each day this week and just get still. Ask God, Lord, what in my life needs to be girded up? What distractions, what attitudes, what habits are keeping me from being fully available to you? Write it down, reflect on it, and, get someone to pray with you and just speak truth over these things in your life. Start small. You don't want to jump in crazy big, I'm sure, if you've never done this before. Start small in your prayers. Start small in your commitments, but you got to start somewhere. Because if you wait to feel ready, you might wait forever. But if you walk with God, even if you're limping, even if you're unsure, you're going to find that he meets you right there where you are. God didn't call Jeremiah once he was confident. No, he called him when he was obedient. And the same goes for us. Preparation is not about perfection. It's about positioning ourselves to respond when God says go. And folks, that's all that I have for this week in this episode today. Next week in part 2, we're going to talk about what it looks like to move forward once you've girded up. So once you've gotten ready, we're going to talk about those next steps after you've gotten ready and how to take that next step with courage, clarity, and faith. And folks, until then, I encourage you to keep showing up, doing what you do. Keep surrendering to that mess in your life, giving it to God, and walk boldly toward that life that God has called you to live. Remember, you don't have to be perfect, but you just have to be prepared. And as I always say each and every week, I love y'all and enjoy the rest of this week.